working?
Well, it says it's recording, but
So I'm assuming you guys can see my slides, what I'm sharing.
Yes, we can.
yes,
Yep. Okay, let's get going then. Okay, welcome everyone. So this is our second OAUTH interim meeting. So that this is the note well. As a reminder, this applies here too. Note taker Jared, thank you for taking the notes for us this time too. I appreciate that. Done that last time, and that was great. So the meeting today will be focused on nested JOT and JOT profile for access tokens. But as a reminder, we still have 4 more meetings to go, and this is the full list here. So, and we will be meeting every Monday, the next 4 Mondays. So this the agenda for the meeting today is nested JOT and JOT profile for access tokens, and I will get started. So hopefully it will be my presentation. First, before I start, any comments, questions, any agenda bashing? Okay, so I'm expecting my slides, my presentation to be kind of quick. So we give tutorial more than half an hour. So hopefully we'll get there. Okay, so nested JOT, we've talked about this a few times already. So this hopefully this time we'll make some progress with this. So 7519 defines the concept of JOT, and inside that there is the concept of a nested JOT. So the concept of a nested JOT is just a JOT that has a payload as another JOT. So that concept that defines that RFC has some limitation, and that limitation is related to the fact that the enclosing JOT, the outer JOT, doesn't have its own claims. It only contains the enclosed JOT. So the goal of this simple draft is really to extend that scope, meaning that we want also the enclosing JOT to have its own claims beside that whatever the nested JOT itself. So there are three use cases. I think we've talked about 2 of them in the past, and we add another one that was we'll talk about this in a second. So the first one is a native app use case. In this case, we have a native app, that needs access to 2 different services: a telephony service controlled by an authorization server, and a non-telephony service that is controlled by an OpenID provider. And the native app is aware of the authorization server only. It's not aware of the OpenID provider. So the flow starts with the native app launching a browser to allow the user to authenticate itself. The browser calls the authorization server, which redirects it to the OpenID provider. The user authenticates, and a code is provided. That code will be then provided to the native app. The native app will then use that code to contact the authorization server, which will then exchange that code for a token from the OP provider, and then create its own token and embed that OP token inside the token provided by the authorization server, and then send it back to the application. The application will be able to validate the outer token, which was provided by the authorization server, and then act upon it and be able to extract the nested token and act upon it. So the second use case is a stir use case. If you're familiar with stirs, this is a mechanism to address robocalls and problems with the incoming calls that you can fake the number associated with the call. So the flow in that case, you have A is calling B with a JOT. That JOT is just a they call it a passport, but it's a JOT that contains the number to validate that whoever made that call actually owns that number. So A calls B. A's call is retargeted to C, so that the service that does the retargeting will create yet another JOT, and it will have information about the retargeting, and then send that and embed the original JOT inside the new token and new JOT, and send that the new nested JOT to the new target, which is C. And in this case, C will be able to see that the original call was was targeted to B, and it was retargeted to C. So that's the second use case.
Rifat,
Yeah.
going back to the store use case, I think you should mention to folks on the call who are not familiar with this type of work that this is a quite important development to fight against robocalls.
Yes.
An IETF effort to, like, robocalls showed up in telemarketing, but also in swatting. These are emergency calls that are placed, sort of fraudulent emergency calls and so on. So, and they happen, the group decided to use JWTs. So JWTs have found their way into other domains as well, besides the classical OAuth use cases.
It's maybe also worth noting, though, that there's a draft for this exact thing, and they have defined their own claim to carry the nested passport JOT.
This was based in exactly on that draft, and I think the draft is called passport extension for the vetted calls, right? And I was
yes.
And I was trying to get them to use kind of this new mechanism, but it was a little bit too late, because I think that the draft is already in with the ISG. So we'll see. It might be too late for that, but anyway, it's based on exactly that use case. That's the use case that I'm describing here, right? Okay, thank you. So the third use case is that somebody from the open source project called the Network Service Mesh, they're working on a project that's similar to that, trying to emulate what Service Mesh is doing, but it's for layer 2 and layer 3. If you're familiar with STO, so they're trying to do something like STO, but for lower layers. So in their case, they have a bunch of intermediaries, and those NSM messages will pass through those multiple of those intermediaries. Each intermediary might transform that request, and if they transform it, then they will create their own JOT and include whatever JOT they received from the previous intermediary and forward it to the next one. So that's the third use case. So how do we want to kind of what the draft is proposing a way to kind of get this going? So the first one is to define a content type header, a new one, to indicate that the nested JOT the outer JOT will have its own claims and complies to this. So one suggestion is to call it an eng JOT, right, for nested JOT. And then we define a new claim inside that JOT, and we could call it NJOT again. And here's an example of how would that look like. You have the CTY at the top here, and you have the nested JOT here in the payload. So it's really simple, not really nothing complex here, but it's useful in a bunch of use cases. So questions, or if people think we are ready to adopt this. So I think some people are in line here. Okay.
Brian, did you want to say something?
I think Mike has a question maybe or something.
Annabelle was first in the queue.
Annabelle's
Yes.
first.
Okay, Annabelle, go ahead, Annabelle.
Do we have somebody managing the queue or tracking the queue?
That would be me, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Cool. So Annabelle Backman, Amazon. So I understand the use cases that you laid out. I definitely get why someone would want to nest a jot within another jot. What I'm not clear on is the value of defining a specific claim that says essentially that really is just stating the type of its value. That the njot claim is the only thing that tells me is that the value of this claim is a nested jot, but it doesn't tell me anything about what that value means or what it represents, which is not really what we use claims for, right? Like is describing the value, the nature of the value. It's a subject. It's not string. It's subject. And I guess in one of the examples you mentioned earlier, I think the stir use case, it was all actually noted that group, the people working on that have gone and defined their own claim. I would expect that's what most use cases would want to do, because you'd want a claim that indicates some semantics to it. And in some cases, you may actually need to nest multiple jots in the same, in the same jot, in which case this one claim no longer really makes sense. So I guess I want to step back and understand the specific problem of here that we're really trying to solve. If there's a need to kind of formalize some semantics around or syntax around how you should embed a jot as the value of a claim, then maybe that's something we could talk about. Maybe there's room for a standard or a BCP there. But I don't see the value of just a stock njot nested jot claim itself.
So your objection to this claim here, right?
I specifically, I guess that my objection is sort of to the idea of a general purpose claim for representing a nested jot, absent any kind of semantics or meaning attached to that.
Okay, next.
So the next person was Mike Jones. Hey, Mike.
Hi. First, I'll say that having thought about this for a bit, I think naming would be clearer if we don't try to reuse nested jot term, because that already has a well-defined meaning in the jot spec. And this is not that. It's related, but it's different. So if this goes forward, I would request that we stop using the nested word. Use a word like enclosed or included or jot claim, jot valued claim, something that says what it is. And, in the introduction, you could describe the relationship between nested jots and this, where in a nested jot, the jot itself is the payload, where in this case, the jot itself is a claim of another jot.
Yeah, okay.
And I do support us trying to grapple with Annabelle's question about is defining a syntax necessary or sufficient, or your passport example, do you actually want to know what are the semantics of this jot?
Yeah. Something to think about for sure.
I'm not presupposing either answer, but think it's an important question.
Somebody is
I have to
typing in the
say.
back. If you thanks, Mike. Brian?
That was me typing. I'm sorry. Forgot I was waiting on cue. So I got a few comments. Gonna pile on a little bit to what was said, but bear with me while I run through these. One would be to second the differentiation between calling it nested and something else, because nested was designed for a very different sort of purpose, allowing for signed and encrypted JOTs together, and the name, for better or worse, the name has taken on that connotation. And along the same lines, I think it might not be appropriate to call that a limitation, as you've been describing it, so much as just the reality of how that particular construct works. It was designed specifically to do that, to allow for sign-in encryption. So it's maybe a little bit too far to say it's something that was a limitation of that. It did exactly what it was supposed to do.
Okay, fair enough.
It doesn't, it doesn't accommodate what you're doing here, but maybe it's something that was missing, or I don't know. I'm not sure. I sort of agree with Annabelle's comment about sort of application specific needs, but also recognize that there's maybe some value in having a common defined name where this kind of the problem is I don't know what to call it, included, encapsulated JOT goes. So I can kind of see both sides of that, but it's worth considering more. One area that I'm really struggling with the need for, as well as the way it's been done, is the content type here. Noting, for example, like the passport diverted piece that you mentioned as a use case, they don't use any kind of content type to distinguish the actual content of the JOT itself. So in one real world case, it's not needed. And just in general, I struggle with why you would need a content type to indicate particular claim content in the claims themselves. Like, we don't have a content type to indicate that there's a sub or a audience or other various sort of components of it. In fact, I don't think there's even a content type to say this is a claim set itself. So it's feeling like it's I don't know. It doesn't seem necessary to me, and
the only reason I provided this is that I want in the nest, because I use the nested JOT concept, and the nested JOT as it has that definition that the payload will contain only the nested JOT. This was meant to say, hey, the payload will have the nested JOT, but it will have its own claims too. But and if we move to a different name, that we might not need this, but yeah, it's open for discussion on exactly how to do that. I'm not stuck on a specific way. I just want to solve the problem, right?
Yeah, well, just for kind of taking it back then to that example, or trying to borrow from how that works, the content type in that context is really useful for processing, because as you're rolling through processing the sort of the crypto layer of the JOTs, you're able to look at the content type and determine whether it needs to be further processed, like check the signature and so forth, or whether to expect that there's actually claims inside here, where this is, it's sort of a different use case, where I think all the semantics and sort of understanding of what needs to be done are really defined at the claim level. You understand that there's a nested JOT by virtue of encountering the nested JOT claim. So I guess I would say, if we do proceed with this at all, or even in the draft itself, I don't think the content type's necessary, and it only maybe potentially confuses the issue. Not to mention that also it's supposed to be a media type. So
yeah, I'm not really hung up on this.
okay.
Like, just it's up to for discussion, absolutely. So nothing. is just a draft, the initial thing to start the discussion. But yeah, if we need to change it and remove it, I'll be fine with that.
Tony.
So I agree with the need for this. We're having some of this discussion over in the mobile driver's license area, and we have a need for these nested claims as far as proof presentations are concerned, and we need to have some form of claim aggregation and yet have some tracing of separated claims. So this gives us basically what we want for the for the mobile driver's license. I do share some concerns over the naming of this and do we need a separate thing on this, but that I think the use case goes beyond what you're presented as far as passports, because we can get into a lot of them as far as the mobile driver's licenses are concerned.
I think George is next. No, Annabelle. Sorry, Annabelle. You again.
Yeah. So yeah, regarding the naming thing, I agree with the concerns that have been raised there. One an idea I want to throw out for that, if this work moves forward, one way to think of this is that if we're describing this outer jot itself, it's playing an envelope role. So maybe that's a way to think about the naming here, as describing not the nested jot term kind of refers to the thing inside, but if we want to describe what the thing outside is, it's not a nested jot, it's an envelope around some payload that is a jot. So food for thought there. Tony, I'm curious on the use case that you just raised, since you're saying you see a need for this. I'm wondering what you see that's missing today in terms of being able to embed a jot within a jot as a claim and define some rules around that.
Multiple subjects and other things that need to be defined.
As far as how does the subject in the outer jot relate or not to the subject of the inner jot?
Yes.
Well, wouldn't that be use case dependent? Like I would think the requirements there for mobile driver's licenses would be different from those for say other use cases.
It may or may not be, but we're looking for a standard way to do this, so, or a well-defined way to do this, and so that we can track backwards for the mobile drives. So that's our basic use case over in the MDL area.
Yeah, I guess the thing I would like to see, and maybe this is an exercise for the authors here, to figure out in these use cases what is there that really is generalizable in terms of those kinds of semantics. Is it the case really that there's kind of a general problem to solve of how we relate this outer JOTS claims to the inner JOTS claims, or is there so much variation between use cases there that it's really best to leave that to individual drafts to sort out as they need? I'd like to see some clarity there in order to, I guess, justify having a spec specifically for this.
This is Jared. Can I jump in? And are you saying like a refers to? So theoretically, what does the nested or the child jot have to be included, or can it just be a reference to? And then if you need that parent jot, you go look it up. That's an extra load on call, but do we always need all the jots included in the single payload?
I guess it depends. It depends on the use case, but I could see like a reference instead of
OIDC defined something. OIDC defined something like that for was it not aggregated claims, the other one distributed claims. So the idea is not unprecedented.
Let's stick with the cube because otherwise we'll never get through this. George, you were next. And
Yeah. So just sort of wanted to echo some of Annabelle's comments. I definitely think we have issues with how do we support multiple of these enclosed JOTs. And it seems to me that from a semantic perspective, if I'm designing a protocol, and I think this is where Annabelle was going as well, right? The individual spec for STIR or for mobile driver's license or whatever could define a claim name, and the type of that claim name is an enclosed JOT. But unless there is some way that we're binding all those enclosed JOTs into the, let's say, the overall signature of the outer JOT outside of just the fact that they're present in the body, I struggle to see where we're adding substantial value, right? And I think this gets to the higher level sort of general question that Annabelle was posing as well. Because for me, I looked at all of those use cases and I would just define a claim, you know, whether that's OPID or OPJOT or whatever is my claim name for that particular interoperable spec, right? And say the type of that claim is a JOT, and you're sort of done, right? Unless we add some additional, security binding or other mechanisms on top of it.
We're running out of time very quickly here, so maybe we can cut the mic here, Anis, and let Mike and Phil chime in here.
Yeah, it's probably best. A lot of feedback. Mike?
Yeah, I wanted to support the comment that I don't think new content type is warranted. In fact, the content type, it's normally something that would apply to the whole body, where this is kind of odd in that it's saying that it's talking about the value of one of the claims being present. So I would just delete the content type. And the question is, do we have a generic enclosed JOT claim, or do we do as aggregated claims do and as Passport does, have claims that also have a semantic meaning where they have JOTs as values? And, I certainly support Tony's mobile driver's license use case. Do question whether the mobile driver's license spec doesn't want to define its own claim, saying this enclosed JOT has this particular meaning, as opposed to just there is an enclosed JOT. Again, I'm not presuming an answer, I'm just asking a question.
Thanks, Mike. Phil, last.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Going to Mike's term about closed versus nested, one of the things that struck me that might be interesting, not saying it's actually useful, is that nested suggests that a nested JOT, have another nested JOT would bring out these like a chain, and you'd have a block kind of feature. I don't know if there's use case for that, but that would be one of the big differences. And I don't know if that's a lot of trouble, but that was just one of the things that struck me by the term. Yeah. It was the suggestion that you described, Rifat, that as you were going through network layer, each layer might be adding another wraparound to the original token and adding a new layer that can later pulled apart and analyzed. The second I'll make is that typing might make things complex to suggest that you're going to get these things at random and need to know how to process. I think in a lot of cases, context is everything, and you know what the possibilities are, and so I wouldn't get too hung up on, but I don't want to get into that debate too much, but I do see a lot of possibilities there and a lot of use for it. Just not sure how far to lock it down for George's comments as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Phil. And the nested jot concept that you mentioned here is, I think this is the NSM use case. Okay, Hannes.
Yeah, I would say lots of good feedback.
Yeah.
I believe it would make sense to take some of that feedback on board and spin a new document, and then we can post a mail to the list to see whether there's a chance for a call for adoption. I heard a couple of detailed comments on some of the design aspects, which I think can be clarified, and maybe some other use cases covered. And
yeah, I think fair. And I don't know, maybe I'll work with Anthony or Tony if because he has another use case. Maybe I'll work with Tony offline and see if we can incorporate that use case and work on this together. We'll see.
Sounds cool.
Okay.
Okay. Switching on to the next presentation. Can you do that, Rifat?
Vittorio, do you want me to share? Do you want to share?
I'll try to share, and then if it doesn't work, you can share. Fine?
Go ahead. Yeah.
That's it. Mark lets me. Can you guys see my fantastic screen?
Yes, of course.
Works.
It is fantastic, isn't it? All right. Good morning or good evening, depending on your time zone. Thank you for attending this update. This update is about the profile for using JWT in access tokens for OAuth 2. Just to remind everyone what this is all about. This is an attempt to create something interoperable. We know that the JWT is already a mainstream option for issuing access tokens for many commercial authorization servers. And basically what we did in this profile was to identify claims that reoccur very often in those implementations that are used for well-known functionalities such as validating the token, conveying authorization information, sometimes conveying identity information, and it basically created a layout which reflects this, and we had quite a lot of discussions about it. We also created a mechanism for advertising keys, issued values, all the things that are typically used for validating a JWT, and we established rules of engagements for retrieving those keys and using them. And we also defined detailed steps that can be used for validating the claims that we defined as required and for checking signatures. We added detailed security and privacy considerations, given that although this spec doesn't add anything that could not be done before, we do have more information in respect to the baseline of case, and in particular, we know that the JWT is a format that is visible from the requester, and so there are some considerations that needs to be done in here. And also, given that we explicitly call out some identity information, of course, we needed to specify something in terms of privacy. And right now, there is a very strong correlation between the way in which the token is requested and the values that end up the token being issued. This is one of the open matters, and so I won't go into the details here. But anyway, this is a quick summary. Hopefully, all of you guys were already familiar with this, so it just wasted your time. Then we issued a last call on March 23rd, and it was on version 04. And that triggered a number of really good reviews and suggestions. The heroes here are Annabelle, George, Aaron, and others. Thank you guys for your very detailed reviews and your suggestions, and Brian before them. And here are the major changes that occurred inside the spec document since the last call. There were a number of clarifications, such as, for example, the exact behavior that we expect from EMR, SAR, off time, and IET. And I didn't classify these as normative changes because it was just like the language that wasn't particularly clear, but the intent was already there. I clarified that when any of the validation steps in the token validation phase, we need to go for a valid token. Annabelle made an excellent point, what was already done on the call on other spec comments, about the fact that it's pointless to use the different keys for signing a token and access tokens, given that we don't have a mechanism for declaring which key is used for which flavor of token. And so the resource server cannot really distinguish between those two. And so compromising any of the keys in there is enough to compromise everything else. So we clarified that. And then I just lifted verbatim, almost verbatim, the validation steps from OpenID Connect, which had the numbers, but as it turns out, those numbers were just for layout purposes. There was no security intent behind them, and so those have been turned into a list so that people don't think like they must follow a sequence. In terms of normative changes, I had the 7th step in there, which again was coming from the ID token validation heuristics. And it was confusing. And also it created a problem because like we were just saying, well, you got to re-authenticate, but we weren't really providing any mechanism for telling the client that they need to authenticate. And so by eliminating that entry, we killed 2 birds with 1 stone. We no longer have a confusing step, which over-index on the off time versus other authorization information. And we don't have the problem of defining that mechanism. I think we should, as a working group, define that mechanism, but this spec is not the right place. And also, like there was an enormous amount of cleanup, like really, really lots of typos, improper abbreviations. So bigger cleanup. Thanks again for the people that gave feedback. Now the open questions. The first easy one is, should we, and actually for all of them, I have slides, so don't jump on it too quickly. For the first one is simple, like JWTI, IET, some people think it should be required. I happen to be among them, but before switching that, I just want to hear what the consensus of a Borg cube is. The other part, which is like a big hot topic, is the fact that the spec is super strict about number of resources in the request, number of resources that end up in the audience, and some people don't like how strict that is. And so I'll give you a quick justification of why that is the case, and then we can see what we can do about it. I'm open to relax the language, but I just wanted to do a last-ditch attempt. And then we got to 2 recent comments, one about the fact that apparently the profile doesn't define enough of a profile. And so here I'd ask basically what is missing, if there is something that is missing in terms of defining the layout. And the other part is like a general considerations about privacy. I put it in quotes because it's like a catch-all term. So without further ado, let me go to the first one. And here the matter is easy. Should we switch those guys from recommended to required? No one has an opinion? Everyone has an opinion.
We're not seeing your first suggestion slide, Vittorio.
You are not seeing my slides?
No, I am seeing his slide.
We do.
I'm seeing it.
Okay, all I see is
Sorry,
working
my
group
slide.
last call.
No.
So which slide are you guys seeing right now?
The JTI IATB required.
Yes, that is the one that is meant to be shown.
Yeah, you may have to restart your WebEx. It happens a lot.
And when you say you mean me, or you mean the people that don't see the slides?
No, not you. The people.
You're fine, Victoria. It's whoever's not seeing the slides, their system is in error.
Thank you.
Annabelle Backman, I jumped into the queue in the midst of this slide discussion. I totally support making JTI and IAT required, 100%. This is a good opportunity for that. I don't see any reason why an AS would not be able to include them, and they provide significant value for minimal cost.
Thank you, Annabelle.
Okay, Dick. Hear you, Dick.
Can't hear me.
Now we can.
Now we can.
Can hear me. I think they should be required. I think let's get them in there. There's no downside of having them in.
All right.
Me as a vote for they should be required.
This is fantastic. That's great.
This is Roman speaking. Maybe we can ask it the other way. Is there anyone that doesn't feel that they should be required?
Thank you. That's a good flip. All right.
Yeah, I think you have your feedback, Victoria.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Excellent. Now the complicated one. So the reason for which today there is a strong language, and in the next slide I have the language that we currently have, is basically this thing boils down to today the spec requires, actually, you know what? Let me just show the language. Today the spec requires that when a requester specifies a resource, and there are scopes, like if you are making a request and you are requesting one resource and scopes, or a list of scopes, that you have only one resource, and that all the scopes that you are requesting are relevant to that resource. Or if you are asking for multiple scopes and no resource, for example, all the scopes refer to only one resource. And the reason, just to show graphically what the security considerations say, is to prevent the situation that we have in here. Here you have two APIs, and both APIs declare scopes that are valid for them. And if you have multiple resources in the request, say that I ask for both of those APIs, and say that there is one common claim, common scope between those, then you would end up in a situation in which your token would be ambiguous. Let's say that you wouldn't know whether the scope read applies to the first API, to the second API, to both. Now, we had a long discussion sorry, my English is not great today. We had a long discussion on the list about mitigations, and it's true that potentially you can do scope stuffing. Like you can have, instead of read, you could have a scope which is clearly referring to one particular API. The complication there is that when you are running a system where you have many potential APIs, like a multi-tenant system and similar, then typically the identifiers that you end up using end up being pretty large. And then having scopes that contain identifiers, so the naive brute force solution, is just hard. Let's say that you have really a lot of stuff. You end up with tokens that are very large. And defining a mechanism in here for tying scopes to resources, like little tables, I think it goes well beyond the scope of the interop profile. Let's say that, of course, I didn't poll all the possible systems, but of all the JWTs that I observed in the wild, no one had anything even remotely to that level of sophistication. So that's why today we have that language. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is not a hill I'm willing to die on. So if you guys are compact in pushing back and saying, no, this thing is too restrictive, just turn it into a security consideration in which you warn people against the possibility of this scope confusion, then I'll do it, as long as there is enough, I would say, popular support for that. But I think it's a lost opportunity because I observe so much abuse of scopes out there. And I think that if we would have given a bit more guidance, then we could have made people develop systems which are, like I say, better designed. But anyway, I'm starting to ramble, so I'll just open to your comments.
I think Annabelle first.
So yeah, thanks for bringing this topic back up. I know we've talked a lot about it. I think the language in the current draft is is trying to block or stop this confusion between scope and resource mismatch by prohibiting a specific behavior or a specific scenario that may or may not lead to that. And I don't think we need to do that. I think a more broadly applicable approach would be for us to explicitly call out what we're trying to block. And I suggested some language on the list for that I'll quickly read here because it's one sentence, that the AS must not issue a JOT access token if the authorization granted by the token would be ambiguous. And then we can have some security considerations that explain scenarios where that might come up or what that means or why that would be a problem. I think there's a lot of different ways, and I listed some of them on the list. People can look at the mail archive for that, for where you may have multiple resources and multiple scopes, or multiple resources and no scopes, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of use cases that are where we should be able to use JOT access tokens for those. And we have to remember as we look at examples out there in the wild that if you're just looking at the people using JOT access tokens today, that's only a subset, right? There's going to be a lot of people out there who aren't using JOT access tokens because there's no standard for it, right? There's no spec for it, or who might be using JOT access tokens, but you don't know that because you can't inspect them. So let's we should be careful not to over-index on those particular use cases. Yeah.
Thank you, Annabelle. This is good feedback, and I agree, of course, with the spirit. Like I'd like these to be as applicable as broadly useful as possible, and I also agree with the spirit of saying don't issue a token if doing so would lead to ambiguity. The thing that I'm always a bit concerned is leaving exercise to the reader, or like the Fermat syndrome, as in like this spec margin is too small to contain the actual guidance, so you figure it out when it's ambiguous or not. And in an ideal world, that would work, but like a lot of people aren't ultra deep or aren't as deep as us. And so the attempt that I was doing here was like, and admittedly, you're right, I was over-indexing on my own personal experience in running such a service and typical mistakes that people were doing. So I'm perfectly open to change the language to state, like rather than depicting one particular scenario where this happens, just saying, here is an outcome that you don't want to ever produce, and then add a bit of details in the security consideration. That's my current position.
Yeah, I think the reality is that like the AS has to be doing this anyway, right? Like if the AS is getting a request that has multiple resources and multiple scopes in it, they better understand how to interpret that in order to properly present consent and what. And maybe their use case doesn't need that, but generally speaking, like the AS better understand what it's being asked to grant authorization for, right? So I think to some extent that the work is already on their plate, but we can help them with security considerations there. The one last point I'll make, you talk about missed opportunity. I think the real opportunity for this work is what we'll talk about in the next meeting, and that's rich authorization requests. I think that's our opportunity to provide the strongly semantic way to specify what you're accessing or what you're requesting authorization for, and from which endpoints, et cetera, et cetera. And at that point, we probably are going to want to be able to support multiple resources in JOT access tokens. And so if you have language here that prohibits that, then how does that work going forward?
That's also a good point. Thank you, Annabelle. This is very useful.
Then thanks for all your work on this. This is great work. I'm really happy to see it going forward.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Anyone else? I don't see the queue because of the chat.
I'm
Georgian. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm next. So again, yes, thank you, Vittorio. And I guess because I wanted to echo a little bit Annabelle's point in regards to there probably are a lot of other deployment mechanisms that weren't seen in the sense of like, here's the public people who are using JWT for an access token. And so there are probably valid deployment models that don't use the exact mechanisms here. I don't have a problem with using recommended language as opposed to required for some of these things either, if we want to sort of like say, put a little bit of a, here's a recommended way to approach scopes, right, to help people who are doing it for the very first time. I do think whether it's RAR or some other best practice, there is a lot of value to describing here's a set of models for how to deal with scopes and resources and audiences that are, deemed to be best practice models. And that would be a whole separate doc, right? That would be more along the best practice kind of a thing, where we could then dig into the relationships between these things and how do people do it the right way. I just feel like right now we'd either be forcing people to create values that are pretty much meaningless in order to meet the requirements of the spec, if we continued with the way it is now. And I don't know that adds value. So I guess my recommendation would be, maybe we describe a sort of like one possibility of a good practice in the doc and use recommended language, right, which doesn't prohibit these other use cases that we either know about in the wild today or that are coming. And if we want to, as an as a group, we can tackle the larger issue of, what is a good way to deal with scopes? Because if you're a small site running something, you could easily use per API kind of scopes because you may not have that many, or you could turn them into sets, right? And it's a perfectly valid deployment model, right? If you're a multi-tenant enterprise as a, identity as a service entity, right? Yeah, that may not be a viable option. So anyway, just some thoughts there.
Great. Thank you, George. That's great. I also really like the mention of the fact that if we really want to go after practices, perhaps there's its own document where we have room to explore those relationships, as opposed to just somewhat try to smuggle it in here where the purpose of the document is different. Thank you. Anyone else? All right, very exciting. So, summary, I'm going to go back to our fantastic spec. I'm going to look at some of the suggested language, and I'm going to do an update and along the lines of what we just said, which is either going toward the recommended or just having in the security consideration something. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so the other matter that we had was the fact that Dennis in particular mentioned that the profile layout, like he finds strange that the spec doesn't provide a profile layout. And actually, my impression is that we do. Let's say that we define the claims that carry the information that we need to carry, and then we just give guidance about how people can extend it in the way that makes sense for that scenario. But even so, here my position is, I think that we do have a layout, and I don't think that we can make it more defined at this point unless there are specific concepts that are missing. Let's say that I don't think it makes sense to tell people you can't add your own claims, for example, or making everything mandatory. Like there are some things that are optional for good reasons, because we don't think that they should always be used. So basically, the question is there anything missing from the current layout that we should add?
One of the problem is that there are parameters that are mandatory.
Sorry.
They should be optional.
Sorry, who's speaking?
Dennis speaking.
Yeah, can you please get into the queue, like add yourself to the queue? Brian, you're first.
I was jumping on too late for the last topic, and
okay.
Maybe just indulge me for a minute before we come back to this. You had in a much earlier slide that you clarified the meaning of auth time, ACR, AMR. And I was trying to look at the diff for this, and it looks like the clarification was actually just removing a bunch of text, explaining it. And I'm struggling a little bit with how that helps. I actually sort of liked the text that tried to at least put some constraints on what those meant to be something that was meaningful in the world of an access token. And now, unless I'm reading it wrong, it just defers to OIDC with no further context.
Are you done? Can I answer, or do you want to add something more, Brian?
I was just rambling at that point. So if you could shed some light on, or at least clarify for me what's going on there, yes, go please.
So here there is one issue, which is I skipped one IETF, and so some of the work that went in clarifying auth time, AMR, ACR happened before the last call, and some of that was actually including feedback from you and from Annabelle. And what happened was that a lot of the things that were inside the description of each claim was actually placed forward in the first paragraph. And then basically each description were basically echoing with a slightly different language, the language that was in that first paragraph. And so Annabelle made the first suggestion to get rid of it, and I didn't. And then she repeated the suggestion later on. And then at that point, I just looked at this and I saw that she did have a point, and so I eliminated it. So the reason for which I say clarification is in here, but the only thing that you see after the last call is the deletion, is that there was a bit more of discussion that occurred before the last call, and that did have effect as in changing the language, so actual clarification.
So we have one more minute here, just to let Dennis chime in here. Go ahead,
Thanks.
Dennis. Sorry. Thanks, Brian. Dennis.
Thank you, Brian.
Well, all my concerns are related to privacy issues. And first of all, I observed that there was problem with properties which are called untraceability, unlinkability, and data minimization. And basically, the protocol has been described is unable to support these three privacy properties. I started with untraceability, where basically the authorization server is able to know exactly where the token will be used, and then is able to act as big brother. The second point is that, in fact, there are two parameters that are mandatory, sub and client ID. And I sent an email just a quarter of, just before this meeting, less than an hour ago. Since these two parameters are required, it's impossible to support data minimization. And then you have the problem that servers can link the tokens from different clients, which is not very good when you want to support privacy. So basically, my observation is that the current profile is unable to support good privacy principle. And this should be indicated in the privacy consideration section. And another detail, which there is a must not in the privacy consideration section. I think that client should be able to inspect the content of the token, because if they want to be confident that the content is correct, they should be able to do that.
Rifat, do I have time to answer, or does this
Yeah,
needs,
maybe one sentence and two if you want, and otherwise we'll have to
he
take.
brought up 4 points. I think I needed to mention those 4 points.
Okay.
So on the on the privacy principles, the general point is I don't think that here we are adding anything that isn't already in OAUTH. And so I don't think that placing goals for this particular aspect that are somewhat higher or different than the entire framework is appropriate. From the point of view of knowing where the token is going, RFC 6750 explicitly say that it's important for the authorization server to include the identity of intended recipient, typically a single resource server or list of resource servers in the token. So here we are following best practices that are described by an RFC in using tokens. The fact that these tokens has a particular format doesn't change the goal of the token, in my opinion. And the same goes for resource indicators. For what concerns the collusion with the sub, there are other mechanisms that are not about the presence of a sub, but the content. So you can use the PPID, you can use directed identifiers if you want to prevent APIs from correlating different tokens. It's just a matter of what the authorization server decides to place in the sub. The sub doesn't have to be the same for API 1 and API 2. For what concerns the client inspecting the content of the access token, that's just a architectural mistake. Let's say that the fact that I'm using a JWT doesn't change anything in terms of how the information flows between the authorization server and the resource server. The access token remains an artifact meant to gain access to the resource server. The content is a matter between the resource server and the authorization server. And even if I can look inside the token, there is no guarantee that I will keep being able to look, that I will understand what I see, that what I see is in a format that I can parse. But we can keep on with a discussion on the list on these 2 particular points. But just to make my position clear, right now, I'm not convinced at all that those 2 are problems.
Okay, thank you, Vittorio. I think this concludes our meeting today. So, like we don't have time. We our time already. Thanks, Vittorio, and we will meet next week, guys. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.